Number 1.
The reports began flooding in early yesterday afternoon. Bears, deer, elk, and even smaller creatures like squirrels and skunks had been spotted fleeing from the Stafford Valley in historic numbers.
The only known cause of such a mass migration was a forest fire, but a thick fog hanging over the valley prevented our helicopters from getting a good view of the forest. When the helicopter couldn't get a visual, they sent in me and Jim, 2 forest rangers, to check the area for fires or other potential sources of the disturbance. The fog covering the road made winding up the mountain pass in our rickety Forest Service Jeep even more nerve-wracking. We've had waited for the conditions to improve, but the risk of a potential fire meant we had to act now. "There's no way it was a fire," Jim said, gripping the steering wheel tightly as he pulled around another curve. "What else could explain the animal migration?" I asked. He shook his head. "I don't know, but just look out there. We're in the middle of the rainy season. It's so humid that the fog is still hanging around at," he looked at his watch, "10 a.m. Fire just doesn't fit." I peered out the window at the trees, peeking through the fog. Jim was right, but I suppose it didn't matter. Either way, we had a job to do. When Jim pulled off the side of the road, we readied our equipment. A GPS to track our location, sensors that check the air for smoke, and a can of bear spray each, just in case. When we were ready, we left the road behind and began walking to the woods. The fog hung heavy in the air, but soon the trees pressed in tight enough that they blocked our vision instead. After a few minutes of walking, we stumbled across a game trail carved into the ground and began following it instead. I held my sensor out, constantly checking for smoke. There was nothing. Jim walked ahead of me as I scanned the air in another direction for signs of a fire. When I turned to look at him, he paused, then asked, "Did you hear that?" I paused, listening hard. I did hear it. A scuttling sound came from our left, like a cockroach on kitchen tiles. A multi-legged creature leapt from behind a tree and ran toward us. Jim brought his foot down hard on the creature with a wet crunch. When he lifted his foot, it exposed an absolutely massive spider. Must have been over a foot in diameter. I knelt down, examining the body closely. "This is incredible." "Incredible that a spider the size of a dinner plate just tried to eat us?" Jim asked, still breathing hard. "No. Incredible that a spider this big exists. Arachnids were my specialty in college. Australia has the biggest spiders in the world, but I didn't think even Australian spiders grew this big." Jim stood up and looked around. "Well, that explains the migration. Invasive spider species arrives and starts eating all the small mammals and disrupts the ecosystem. It all fits." "Yeah, makes sense." I got to my feet, then shook my head. Another invasive species. It had the potential to disrupt the entire food chain if it spread to other areas. I looked up at Jim. "We should still probably check to make sure there wasn't a fire. In the meantime, keep an eye out for any webs or other spiders. If we can identify exactly which species this is, it'll help the bosses plan for it." We continued deeper into the forest, stopping periodically to check for forest smoke. There was nothing, of course. I was relatively sure we'd find the answer to our riddle. When another slightly smaller spider ran away, I motioned for Jim to follow me after it. I hoped it would lead us to a web or perhaps to a few of its eggs. The spider scurried around a thick mossy tree. I walked around the corner and came to a stop, mesmerized by a new sight. A black mass the size of a car was strung up in a web between the branches of the tree. The black mass writhed as the spider we've been chasing climbed up the web and disturbed it. That's when I realized what I was seeing. It was hundreds, maybe thousands of the spiders. They were all clumped together in the tree, similar to how baby spiders clump together. "Oh my god," Jim whispered from behind me. We slowly backed up down the game trail as the mass of spiders continued to uncoil. "Those," I said. My mind couldn't fathom what I was seeing. I understood the number of spiders, I understood the behavior of the clumping. No, what I didn't understand was something else. "Those are all babies," I said. "Only baby spiders clump up like that." Jim turned to stare at me, wide-eyed. "If these are the babies, then where's the—" He trailed off. Then we both turned to take off down the game trail another direction. I thought I heard skittering coming from all around us, so we didn't slow down until the end of the game trail. Jim fumbled at his coat for the GPS tracker so we could find our path back to the car. "Come on," I urged. A muted thump echoed from through the trees, larger, heavier than we'd heard before. Another thump. They continued, each time faster and closer. Jim turned and ran through the woods. I followed close behind, my adrenaline pushing me to keep up. We burst from the tree line and made it to the Jeep. Jim threw it into drive and started heading down the road. I pulled out my phone's camera and turned around, taking a picture of the still foggy road behind us, and this is the picture I took. We're driving back right now. All I can say is, if you live in the woods of Western Virginia, you should be aware that there's something in the woods nearby. Number 2. Mommy? It started with Amy sitting cross-legged on her beanbag, waiting for me to find my keys. She itched her leg through her striped leggings. "My leg feels funny." "It's probably pins and needles, baby." Amy had always been a fussy kid, but even more so now she was old enough to know that if she was sick, she wouldn't have to go to school. She'd be a teenager soon, and I knew I'd eventually miss the clingy stage, but today couldn't be one of the rare days I indulged her. "What's pins and needles?" she asked me quietly, fiddling with her keyring. "Does your leg feel tingly?" "Uh-huh," she nodded. "Kind of itchy?" "Uh-huh." "Well, pins and needles. You'll live." She limped dramatically all the way down the drive to the school bus, and I sighed as I waved goodbye. Tough love, I thought. It had to happen. As I shut the front door, something in the hall carpet caught my eye. A little round speck of white, wriggling. Amy had been tracking through the garden last night. That was likely where the maggot came from. I swept it outside and squashed it under my boot on the front step. I woke up to screams that echoed down the hallway. "Amy, what's wrong?" I ran over and gasped as I pulled her covers away. Her bed was covered in blood, so much of it I could barely tell where it was coming from. "Where does it hurt?" "Pins and needles," she whimpered. She looked feverish, almost delirious. "Pins and needles." She frantically raked her fingernails over her leg as I scrambled to hold her hands away from the deep gashes that she had gouged out. Phone. I needed a phone. I needed to call someone. Amy's kicking was growing weaker as her blood soaked the bed, and I grabbed a towel. I needed to stop the bleeding, but when I tried to lift up her pajamas, her hands fought me back. "Let me see, baby. Let me see." I wanted my voice to be calm, but I was shaking too hard. "It hurts," she sobbed, thrashing Get away from me. We struggled for a moment, then her fingers slipped over the fabric. I finally managed to peel it off. Her eyes unfocused for a moment, seeing only a mass of yellow. Then I saw what was infesting Amy's leg. Maggots. The top layer of her skin was peeled away and exposed a mass of larvae, wriggling and burrowing into her flesh. I gagged. I stumbled to the trash bin as I threw up until my stomach hurt. The screams of my daughter echoed in my ears as the world span and I felt my head hit the floor. "Look, Mom!" Amy's crutches scraped against the ground as she moved toward the taxi that was waiting for us in the hospital bay. "Be careful," I called after her. Couldn't help but smile at the look in her face. She was going home for the first time in 3 months and the sun was shining. It was almost easy to forget what had happened. Dr. Marlin, her doctor, was the one to help her into the car. It wasn't part of the procedure, but he'd been the one that made her smile during the long weeks of recovery. He shut the car door and exhaled a, well, this is it breath. Well, I never thought I'd say this, but in 3 months, Amy has recovered from the worst infection I've ever seen. She's a special girl. I nodded forlornly. She certainly was. I wish I'd been there for her. The words I didn't want to say came out. If I hadn't passed out, I could have called the ambulance sooner. If I'd listened to her when it first started, maybe then... No, Dr. Marlin told me firmly. That's a dangerous path to go down. You have all the time to be here for her now. Those words echoed in my head as Amy sang along to the radio on the way home, playing with the bow-tied bandages on the stump where her leg had been. After dinner, I was sitting at my desk when I felt my scalp start to tingle. It was an itch inside my ear that I couldn't reach. Then it moved behind my eyes. I absent-mindedly scratched until I reached for my charger and caught sight of myself in a mirror. My scalp was red raw from itching. How had I not noticed? I walked to the mirror and looked closer. I pulled my hair apart and moved so close that my breath steamed the glass. Beneath the skin, in the white of my scalp where my skin was almost translucent, something buried deep was wriggling. Mommy? Amy's small voice came from behind me, and in the reflection, I saw her itching her ear. Pins and needles. Number 3. I called him every word you can think of. The F word, the N word, the C word, and the Z word. And don't even ask me what the Z word was. It got to the point where nobody wanted to be friends with him for fear of association. It made him a social outcast, and I became the king of 7th grade. He was a smart kid, gifted even, but that only made it easier for me. If I remember right, he skipped a grade or two because of how fast he could process information. He was a genius, yeah, but for all that intellect, could never figure out how to act like a normal kid. He'd melt dolls on the playground at recess, hiss at people when they tried to touch him, make up weird stories about how he'd go monster hunting on the weekends like a hero. Back when you're 13, you made stupid choices and do stupid things, mostly because you don't understand that all of you have the rest of your lives left. You don't understand that your classmates, even if they're weird or annoying, are also individual people and deserve to be treated as such. The regret didn't kick in for me until senior year of high school. I had heard that the kid was released from a psych ward after some mental breakdown, and I felt that I might be partially to blame. Rumor had it he was on serious meds but was taking classes from home. He had taken a turn when he got to high school, and the class size increased. Instead of branching out and meeting new people, he became even more secluded, surrounded by people he felt never would understand him. I didn't see him much in those 4 years, but felt that my constant teasing and taunts had convinced him he'd always be different. I wanted to call him and apologize for being such an asshole. I wanted to send him a handwritten letter explaining that I was a stupid kid. I wanted to get coffee with him and tell him I should have been better. That's the thing about apologizing when you're wrong. It's painful. I turned out to be a burnout in the end. My college grades slipped as my blood alcohol levels rose, and soon enough I got a letter of expulsion. I was grateful to get a fast food job after years of drifting, even though I was humiliated. Being 26 years old and having a teenager for a boss is a sickening feeling, something I wouldn't wish on anyone. The job was easy enough though, to the point where I'd start sneaking my flask during bathroom breaks or having a quick beer in my car while on break. I'm not proud of it, but you can only get the manager for so many Karens before you mentally slip a little. Cleaning up shit outside the toilet, making trash food in a deep fryer while covered in sweat, and having people complain if you miss a small detail in their meal will whittle away at anyone. I'd love to see politicians work a minimum wage job like that. They'd break down in minutes, and they'd vote to raise wages all around, I bet. That night, the accident was my fault. My flask had been emptied after a hard day and I didn't stop at the red light. Nobody died, but I put myself and a family in the hospital. 2 children were admitted to the ICU. The mother released but stood vigil over her sons. The father was in a coma, and they were unsure how badly his brain was damaged or if he'd wake up. I needed emergency surgery. I know that because the anesthesia didn't take. I was wide awake, wired even. I managed to glance over at the surgeon, hoping to get his attention somehow, hopeful as he met my eyes with a warm smile. I saw Propyl and hand sanitizer scents fill the surgical room. 2 nervous aides were present, following the surgeon like a scared little deer. I wanted to groan that I was being used as an example, but what anesthesia was working prevented me from making any noise. He rattled off the exact procedures he'd be doing to me, promising the aides I was out cold, even though my eyes were open. He said it was a thing some trauma patients did, as their bodies went into overdrive to keep them alive. Something about the brain trying to catch up with what's happening to the body. The aides must have been cheating in their classes because they accepted the explanation with no questions at all. He told them not to be nervous, as he had overcome lots of personal obstacles to get to his position, and the aides would most likely do the same. I couldn't move when it clicked why his voice sounded so familiar, but I wanted to squirm and shake, anything to get their attention so they'd postpone the surgery. I felt the knife slice my chest open. I felt the pull of skin across my ribs. I felt the pressure of my punctured lung deflate. I felt the crack as my broken sternum was rearranged. Felt the setting of broken ribs. I felt all of it. Every little slice or scratch or tear. I even felt his hot breath in my ear when the aides weren't looking. "Remember me?" He grinned manically, laughing under his breath. Turns out, there are far more painful things than just apologizing. That's gonna do it for now, folks. Those are 3 stories I found on the subreddit r/nosleep. Credits, of course, go to the authors who gave me permission to narrate their stories for this video. If you're one of the people listening, hey, thanks for the consent. I appreciate it. Consent is nice, kids. Pay attention. So leave a like if you guys like it. Leave a comment if you think there's something I could improve for the next video. And if you want to see more of my work, if you want to support me or the channel, yeah, go ahead, hit the subscribe button, and I'll see you in the next one.